Um, well, growing up in my house was great. Um, I have three brothers and a sister, and then of course my parents were there, so it was a total of seven of us. But it was great. We woke up every day to music, um, and I mean every day. Um, and music was a big part of what went on in our household. We were very close. Um, it was a great experience. I have wonderful memories of my childhood.
And can you share what maybe a few of those early memories might be of maybe, with your dad or with your siblings
Mm.
and your mom, of course?
Well, with my father, um, I traveled a lot with him.
Oh, did you?
Yes, I did. To his speaking engagements, to meetings, we all did. But early on, um, I remember even flying to New York with him to be on. I think it was the Today Show, whichever one that Barbara Walters hosted. I went with him to that, but of course we didn't make it. We missed the interview, but uh, I went many places with him. He took us to meetings, to his speaking engagements. It was wonderful. I enjoyed very much hearing him speak. It was one thing to hear him craft and put together the speech because he did practice. He worked very late hours into the night typing and rehearsing his speeches. So to actually see the end result and give the speech to an audience was nice to see.
What was he like just as a dad when you were young?
He was a lot of fun. He was a enormous amount of fun. He played with me. He colored with me, and he read a lot to me. Um, we were a reading family, though, actually, lots and lots of books. But I mean, we would go get ice cream at the Dairy Queen. Um, but a lot of times, too, especially on the weekends, he had a second office at his mother's apartment building. And so we would go over there and he'd read his mail and we'd go to the movies. He took us to Six Flags, all the things that most dads would do. He did, you
Hmm.
know.
And do you remember when you would go out with him? Would people come up to you or would people come
Certainly.
up to him? When did you begin to realize that he was much more than just your dad, that he was becoming a public figure? And how was that like for you?
Yes, we couldn't go anywhere. Not to the corner store, not to the doctor, not to dinner without being interrupted at some point by someone who just wanted to shake his hand or wanted to meet him or thank him for something he had done for them in the past or just for the work he was doing. Always, never, never, never were we able to go anywhere without some interruption to what we were doing. And a lot of times my father would be oblivious to that because he was engaged with what we were doing. And I'd nudge him and I'd say, Daddy, this lady's about to come up and ask you something. And he was very generous and gracious. But I think for some of my siblings, they really hated it. But I don't know. I guess I got used to it. You know, I don't know. Early on in my childhood, he wasn't traveling as much, so he was home more. And by the time I guess the 70s, late 70s, I mean, he was really on the road a lot. So my experience, and maybe my brother closest to me, is probably different from the others, that
And
my
you
other three siblings.
and you are the firstborn.
I am the firstborn. And so he was home more in the earlier years than in the later years when my other siblings came along.
And I guess while we're on the early years, do you
Hmm.
remember people coming in and out of your home? Was your home like that? Did
Oh,
people in the
sure,
community come in? People who would be famous outside the walls
sure,
of your house, but to you were just family friends. Who were some of the
sure.
people in and out of your home?
Um, Arthur Ashe. I remember my parents hosted a party for him, but he was there prior to, he and my father and some of my brothers and sisters. We walked the neighborhood. He toured. I've met so many people because of who my father was and just his connections. Richard Pryor. Uh, I even met George Bush, Papa Bush. Um, gosh, the list goes on and on. Local celebs, Walt Bellamy, a blast from the past, huh?
Yeah,
Uh,
bells.
yeah, so so many people. It's the list just goes on and on. I'm sorry I can't come up with even more names, but yes, so many people.
Do you remember any of the SNCC people and others that might have been part of your early life, or
Um,
you got to know a little bit? And what was it like not just seeing your dad elevate his profile, but all of a sudden these people that you knew as just friends of your family also becoming public
sure,
people as well?
sure. I'm trying to think who offhand. Well, of course, you interviewed last night Charles Black. Our families were very, very close. I don't. It became part of the norm, I guess, so to speak. And I think I probably began to realize it maybe around 8 or 9 or so, because people would treat us differently. You know, they'd be a little nicer, a little more accommodating, or let me get this for you, or here's a better seat, or so you notice those extras, and the person next to you isn't getting that kind of attention. So you notice that, or at least I did, at a young age, and it's like, hey, okay, kind of a big deal here. So yeah,
And
probably
did you like that? Did you like the idea of my dad's famous? Or did
um,
you kind of have mixed feelings about it?
mixed, mixed. It was great in some instances, and then a burden in others. Not having the privacy that others were afforded.
Did you feel like you were giving up a degree of privacy
Oh, for
when
sure.
your dad became more well known?
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure.
And
Most
your feelings
definitely.
about that were mixed or resentful, or did you embrace it or just kind
Um,
of live with it?
but just lived with it. Um, I don't think I thought that I could get away from it. There was no escaping it. Uh, so yeah, I just lived with it.
Do you remember the first time you saw your dad on television?
Um, yes, it was the '68 Democratic Convention.
And did you have any idea what was going to happen at that point? Did anybody tell you what was happening at
No,
that point?
no,
You,
no.
you just saw your dad on
It's like,
television?
hey, yeah. I think we were aroused from bed and said, hey, Daddy's on television. If there was an explanation, I don't recall it. I don't remember, but no. And then, he would let us know when he could in advance if he was going to be on something. But, those were the early days of television, so to speak. It was still in its beginning stages. So, uh, yeah, it got to be something that was almost quotidian, that happened all the time he was on, so got used to it quick.
Any other individuals you may have run across with him or talking about
hmm
this that you'd like to share?
Um, well, when I was in high school, part of my high school time was spent in Maryland, Columbia, Maryland. I attended school there for 2 years. And one of the anchors, in, I believe it was Baltimore, was a young Oprah Winfrey. And every day after school, I would come home and uh, maybe catch a soap opera and watch the news while I did my homework. And Oprah was one of the newscasters that I watched. She was my favorite. So on one occasion, my father was visiting me, and probably had a speaking engagement too. And he took me shopping in the local mall there. And we ran into Oprah. And I told him, I said, she does the news. She's on. I watch her every day. I said, and she's coming towards us. And she came up and introduced herself and explained how she was such a great fan of my dad. And I was like, she does the news here, and I watch her. She's great. And look who Oprah is now. I reminded him every time that I knew that he was going to see her. I said, make sure you remind Oprah when you met her and that it was with me in the mall back in, I don't know, maybe it was the late 70s, I think it was. But yeah, who knew Oprah was going to be this huge deal that she is today? I mean, who knew?
You mentioned growing up in a home full of music.
Mm-hmm.
Who are some of the artists and musicians that your dad really loved, and how did he communicate that love of his music to you?
Ah, really loved definitely the Motown sound, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Temptations. He loved the Temptations. He was a huge jazz fan. Chet Baker, Miles Davis. He loved Ray Charles, um, Linda Ronstadt, uh, the Ink Spots, the Four Freshmen. Uh, Johnny Cash was one of his favorites. A Boy Named Sue, he loved that song. And then, of course, there were the movement songs, the Freedom Singers, songs from the movement, the SNCC, Rutha Mae Harris, and those guys here. Got the album here. Uh, these songs really meant a lot to him. And he introduced us to these songs when we were very young. I don't think initially we appreciated them. They were very booming. You know, when you're 5 or 6, they were kind of scary. But um, I later understood really the message that these songs were conveying. He explained that to us, and I still listen to them to this day. All of the music I mentioned to you that he introduced me and my siblings to, we all have a great love for that music.
Were there any particular artists or musicians and singers from the movement
Mm-hmm.
songs that particularly resonated with you or resonated with your dad? You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned the meaning behind some of these songs. Was there anyone in particular that may have stood out more than someone else?
Well, I know that he really loved This Little Light of Mine. He really loved that song and Which Side Are You On? Um, and then, of course, the the Negro National Anthem meant a lot to him. And we all learned that at a very young age. Books were always made available to us. My father's mother took us to the library regularly. And as you know, she was a librarian and taught us how to use the system. So every other Saturday or so, we would make a trip to the library to check out books. I was encouraged to be my own person. Never felt pressure, and if I did feel pressure, it was self-imposed. It was never from my family. My father always encouraged us to follow our own path and whatever it was that we loved and inspired us. Never any pressure. Looking back, I mean, they were so young, so young. I can't even. When I was his age, I wasn't engaged in that way. So that is so impressive.
Did it surprise you that in the latter part of his life and career, he ended up as a college professor?
No, not at all.
Can you talk a little bit about how how he ended up back there and why this kind of work was
Mm-hmm.
so important to him?
Well, it's funny that he did. That was, I think, the hope all along that his parents had for him. It wasn't a life of politics or civil rights. They had hoped that he would be a professor. Um, my father shared with me that he always wanted to be a painter or a poet. And, you know, as circumstance would have it, that's not what happened. Even though he was able to write poetry and did up until the end of his life. But being a professor meant a great deal to him, especially the course that he was teaching, the history of the civil rights movement. He was a big proponent and believer of documenting and sharing the stories firsthand accounts, especially while the people are still here, you know. And of course, like I said, documentation with pictures. It meant a great deal to him to engage with his students and to share that firsthand knowledge, that firsthand account of what happened, what it was like, what they were feeling, thinking, what others were feeling and thinking, the impressions. Uh, it meant a great deal to him. I mean, he was a kind person. He was a good person. Um, he had a giving nature about him. It was innate, it was natural. I hope he's remembered for all of his good works. Um, I hope he's remembered uh, for his tireless efforts. He stayed the course his entire life. I miss him so much. I hope he's not forgotten and remembered always.
Some of the early memories of my dad are where, I was aware of who he was, but he didn't ever say, hey, I'm Julian Bond. He was a very grounded, down to earth person. And he was a very typical father, I say, except for he had just like weird quirks about some of the food that he would eat. He used to like to eat like tomato and mayonnaise sandwiches and like to eat toast with orange marmalade, poached eggs, and these are things that, as growing up as a black person in Atlanta, you didn't, no one ever talked about eating marmalade or poached eggs or tomato sandwiches or stuff like that. And that's pretty much it. He used to drive when we were young, we had a Volkswagen Bug that had a door that would fly open, just randomly. And he would take us to school in that. And it was like more of a typical middle class upbringing. A lot of people think it was much different, but it wasn't. Wasn't anything more than any other family at the time.
Well, when you say a typical upbringing, what were some of the typical things about your upbringing that people might find surprising given your last name and the perception that many people had of you and your family of having a famous father?
Oh well, he would come to PTA meetings. He would come to if we had to meet with our counselor or anything like that. He would come. I guess a lot of people wouldn't expect it, but it was like the mundane things that he would come to our concerts, just like how you would expect anybody else's father to attend or sporting events or anything like that.
And in doing that, did you feel as a young person growing up that people were looking at you differently? Did you feel like you were under a microscope and that you had to, put on a certain persona or behave a certain way? Or were you encouraged just to be relaxed and be yourself?
Well, I was encouraged to be myself, but I guess from the difference with myself and my other siblings is that there were other prominent Atlantans or national figures, here in Atlanta who had children the same age as me. So we were all like together. So we kind of like grew up together as well. So we all had each other. So I guess we never really said it out loud, but we were each other's like support group where we could just be like ourselves, you know. So not really.
When did you start to realize that your dad was more than just your dad, that he was a public figure?
I think it really dawned on me where once I got to travel with him to DC. And while we were there, we were at the White House. He was like, "Hey, let's see, let's see if we can." So I know Walter Mondale. Let's see if we can go in to see him. And without an appointment, we went straight to Walter Mondale's office, and we were talking to him. And I took a picture with him. And it's like, "Hey, I think Jimmy Carter's here." And they're like, "Okay, well, one second, let me see." You know, and they picked up the phone, and we all went in there to his office, and I was just like, "Wow." And then it was like, "Okay, well, thanks for coming by. Well, we got to go." It's like, okay. And I was like, I don't think anybody else could just walk into the White House and do that. And then at that point, I was just like, wow, that was impressive.
So, just you go to Washington D.C.
Yeah, I don't remember what it was for.
But the next thing you know, you're talking to the vice president.
Yeah.
He then arranges for you to see the president. And the whole time, are you thinking, what's going on here?
Yeah, because
this happen, or is this really happening?
Yeah, I was content with being at the White House. You know, like I guess any other child at that age would be like, wow, I'm at the White House. But then just to be able to go those steps further, and just on the fact that it's just like, hey, Julian Bond is here. Send him in.
Just like that.
Yeah. It's like, man. But growing up, knowing that was possible, I never really took advantage of that. Because it just seemed like something that you should just save for times like that. You know, if you were just happening to, of course, if you could get in to see the president, of course you would try. But then not for like trying to get a better seat at a restaurant or something like that. Well, when we were growing up on Sunset, he had his office was in the basement, and he had his wooden desk with his typewriter on there. And he would be typing out his speeches, you know, fiercely, chain smoking while he's doing it. And he would turn around and say, "Hey, kids, listen to this." And he would go through the entire speech and say, "What did you think?" And we were like, "Hey, Dad, that's pretty good." And just through the listening to him type, you know, sometimes he would pause and read some things and do it over again. And I guess the entire speech, you know, through osmosis, you know, you hear the speech, but it was just normal. Whatever you do in the evening. And we would go travel with them sometimes if it was maybe to Montgomery or to Birmingham or South Carolina or someplace, you know, close by, and listen to the speeches. And after you heard them a couple of times, you know, you're just sitting there, and we would notice that everyone, I mean, while he was speaking, it would be dead quiet. Everyone would have laser-like focus hanging on his every word. And we were like, wow, that's pretty good. So he's a good speaker. Everybody saying, oh, your dad is such a good speaker. But then as I got older, thanks to YouTube, you know, you can go back and see some of the speeches or listen to them again. And then when you hear them again, you're like, wow, I mean, that was very radical, or that was militant. And then at the time, they were trying to paint him as both of those things. But I think because of his appearance, perhaps, maybe people didn't think so, you know, because he talked about a lot of things that needed to be changed in society, and that it was basically, I mean, it was 100% true, and no one could debate any of the points that he was making. And I guess because at that time to make changes like that was like completely unheard of. I mean, because it was a complete left turn from where things should be headed.
Did you ever see him kind of just throw up his hands at some point in public and say, enough?
Never in public or in private. He always had, I mean, he was cool. I mean, if there was ever a person, if cool was a person, it was him. Never.
And do you think that that part of that, his personality, the personality that you described, that cool demeanor, worked to his advantage, and then later the advantage of the movement?
Well, yes. I mean, he needed someone like that who, when he would try to debate people, people would try to bait him into anything. They would always try to get him to lose his cool. You know, they would like slightly go off topic and try to make it personal to try to make him upset or knock him off balance. And it never worked. Never worked. I mean, I can't remember, was it George Wallace perhaps? He was on a show with Donahue, and he just tore that guy to shreds. I mean, he made him look like a complete idiot on television, and that it shouldn't have been that hard, but he was everything that guy said. He had a comeback for it. It was just like it was brilliant, and he was just not falling. He was not falling for that. I mean, it would. I don't recall ever seeing him ever be shaken or intimidated by any white extremist.
Where do you think that all came from as one of his children?
Probably, I mean, he grew up in a very academic household. You know, my grandfather was a college professor, college president, and a lot of times where his speeches were very reminiscent of what a professor's lecture would be, to where he's trying to educate you on, instead of lecturing you on political science or whatever, he was lecturing you on the ills of society. And when you're trying to teach someone or be instructional, that's basically the type of persona that you would like to have in order to, when you're speaking to people, you're trying to teach them something, or you're trying to learn something, or do something for their benefit. And I think that's where his personality, I think that's where it came from. He always wanted to be a professor, and in a way he was the professor, or he was the teacher of human and social civil rights. Yes, I can remember he used to love John Coltrane, was one of his favorites. And I can remember as a small child listening to the, improvisational sounds of John Coltrane. It sounded like madness. But as I got older, I was able to appreciate it. And one of the reasons why I was able to do that regardless of what artist that we were listening to, when he would play an album or a record, he would curate the album to us. It's like, okay, well, now this particular artist during this time, this song was about, or they recorded this one in such and such and such, or this song was dedicated to his mother. And we're just like, hey, that's great, Dad. But then after a while, you started to, at the time, we were really young at the time, but as you became older and more mature, you'd be like, oh, yes. I mean, because not only does when you hear the song again, does it take you back to that moment, but it also, you have like a little backstory on the artist or the song or the composer that go along with it. And that I really appreciated that coming up. He used to have a reel-to-reel in our basement. That was also his office as well. And he would just, sometimes he would play it for, he would just take us and play artists, but not just their good songs. He would get into like the deep cuts of some artists as well. And that really led to like a real appreciation for music to me.
And did you inherit that love of music?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have a very vast and expansive jazz collection on CD.
And so, who are some of your favorite artists?
Well, John Coltrane is my favorite. I bet even though I did not like it at first, that now he's my favorite. But I also have like Pharoah Sanders, Miles Davis, Alice Coltrane, his wife, among others, Taj Mahal, Thelonious Monk, the Ink Spots, Modern Jazz Quartet. That was another one of his favorites as well. And I'm trying to think of some other ones. Herbie Hancock. It goes on and on. I mean, my entire music collection is pretty much, probably, I'd say 95% jazz because of that.
What do you see as perhaps the most significant part of his legacy to that part of his career and that part of the civil rights movement?
To that part of the civil rights movement, at that point, his contribution would be, along with being a great speaker, of course, and for being a leadership, but at that point, it wasn't about him. It was about him building a coalition of having everybody. At that point, he was able to bring any and everyone together. And then when he would take on a cause or something like that, he would allow others to be recognized or put other people into the forefront. It wasn't about, it was about himself, but not really. I mean, he understood that he had a certain charisma that people were attracted to him, and if we were going to be a part of this group, we could all do it together. We could go further as a group than I could by myself. And I think during that period, from the '60s all the way up until the late '70s, I think that would probably be the best thing about his legacy. Is that his legacy is not. I mean, he did a lot of other things, but he did it with a lot of great people as well. And even up until um, his last days, he always made sure that if anyone ever gave him some accolades, he would always say, well, he didn't do it alone. And he always wanted to make sure that the other people who were involved got some sort of recognition. Because, I mean, you can't do all that by yourself. And a lot of times, you know, we talk about Andrew Young or Martin Luther King, but there are other people, you know, so there were people who took time out to contribute to pay towards legal fees. You know, who are these people? You know, a lot of their people who have participated have done so anonymously without recognition. You know, for all these years. I think that's important that those people do get something for that, a pat on the back or whatever. He was really big for that. Well, I was at the beginning of my adult life when I found out that being a college professor was what he really wanted to do. And at that time, I was surprised. I mean, because all these years, I guess as a child, he wouldn't really talk to me about all that sort of thing. But I just never knew it, just as it was something that was the norm the entire time. So it was just something that you just took for granted. And so looking back, I mean, it all kind of makes sense to me. I mean, and it wasn't. It's not. I was surprised at the time, but I was happy for him when he finally was able to do that. You know, I know that a lot of people would dream for the notoriety and the fame, but you know, it's kind of that is more fitting to him and his personality to know that hey, I just wanted to be a college professor.
Do you think that fame came to him, or did he seek out the fame that eventually came to him?
I would say that it was he was the right person at the right time.
What do you mean by that?
And where at that particular point in the movement, they needed someone who was very well spoken and intelligent and who could hold their own when it came to uh, participating in any type of debate or argument, you know, with a certain level of intelligence. And not to say that he was the most intelligent person in the world at the time, but within that sphere of influence or what have you, that was the person that they needed. And he, even though that wasn't his first choice, I mean, he pursued it unwavering to the end because he knew that it was bigger than who he was. And as long as he could get people involved and make a change in the world, you know, he was going to do it until it was time for him. It's like, well, okay, well, I've done this long enough. Or maybe I can still do it and still pursue my lifelong dream, which is teach. So he kind of combined the two towards the end. I think he could have, when he became a teacher, he could have been any kind of teacher. He could have been an English teacher or anything like that. But he decided to continue on with his teaching, except teaching what he knew. And then in his teachings, he taught the civil rights movement and all of the other people who were involved in it as well, who may, up to a certain point, may not have gotten the recognition or may have seemed nameless, or a lot of people didn't realize what their contribution to the movement was. Well, I think a lot of people don't realize what he had a very unique sense of humor, in which border it was like dry humor, but he was also very silly at the same time. And he always, I remember as a small child, he would always make me laugh. And then even when, as a teenager, when he would poke fun at me, it was still, I mean, but even though it was at my expense, I also found it to be very funny at the same time. You know, he had a very, I guess you could say he was very easily entertained.
Well, in a lot of ways, it probably wasn't much different than most folks in that, you know, you have brothers, you have sisters, you have a mother, you have a father, you have a house, you have work, you know, you have chores, room cleaning, stuff like that. So that's generally the same, you know, but because of who he was and what he accomplished in his lifetime and what he was trying to do during that time, sometimes as a kid, you know, you didn't understand it, or it was just too big a concept to wrap your head around at 6 or 7 years old. So as I got older and began to understand what was going on, for certain things, it still was important. In other words, like, say, for example, birthdays. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it might be out of town because they had to do something, you know, work related, give a speech, whatever. And sometimes you might miss those. Not often, but sometimes. So, you know, in that aspect, it would be different. Sometimes school stuff as a young child, I can remember a lot of elementary stuff. Both of my parents coming to, you know, the little school plays and stuff like that. So that, to me, I would view that as normal, right? A normal upbringing. But as I got into my teen years, as we approached the 80s, then I was doing different kind of things. You know, I'm 14, 15 years old, so I don't want to be home. You know, I want to be someplace else. So generally speaking, from that time period forward, then I went away to school and college for a while. So there was a time when I actually kind of left. So really about between 18 and maybe 20 was probably the last timeline period that I might have been there. And then after school, you know, you get a place, you move out, do that kind of thing. So some of the experiences that I imagine that my younger brothers and sisters have are going to be obviously different, because we're talking about a lifetime, really, right, of experiences, and each of us is different at a certain point in our life, you know, as we roll back. So if I roll back to 10, my siblings might still be babies. So again, they'll have a different perspective. To what age did I recognize that he was doing something that the average person wasn't necessarily doing? Dad. Right. You know, just being in the Georgia house was different. I mean, it's only a handful of people that get to do it out of the entire state. So it's a very small group of people. And he took us down there a lot when we were kids, you know, doing the page thing. And I love that milk they would give away, that sweet, creamy milk. It was so good. I didn't know at the time that milk was really for cows and that I really shouldn't be drinking it, but it was good at the time. And making those $3, those shiny, pressed $3 at the end of the day, that was a lot of fun, being in the Capitol. And, you know, they have a museum there. I guess it's like a small museum, and they have a huge bison buffalo in there. I was terrified of that thing. I couldn't even, it was on the corner. You know how they have in the Capitol where you can look down the atrium and you can walk around. So they had all those displays out. And on one of the corners, they had a huge bison buffalo in a glass cage. I mean, it was as big as this desk area. I couldn't even go that way. I was terrified of it for years and years and years. So that was something I probably never would have seen, you know, if my father was a school teacher. Maybe we would have gone down there, but it wouldn't have been like that. I mean, it was almost a daily thing, you know, so it was not different in that people might go see their parent at work. If their father's a doctor or a dentist or whatever, a lawyer, teacher, whatever, you just roll up, you go down there. And it was not unlike that going to see him when he got in the Senate. He had his office was right on the side, right up the street from where we are now. And you could literally just whip in, park, walk through that door, and bam, you were right there. So it was, for me, it was very convenient, where he was working and what he was doing. So that, to me, it just seemed normal. Now, on the flip side of that, I guess you could say there are tremendous benefits growing up under that. But for a long time, I didn't know that. I didn't know there were any benefits, and it wasn't until I started getting older, 18, 19, 20s, and people would say to me, why don't you do this? Or why don't you do this? You can do this because of your father and this and that and this and that, And so I really, at that time, I actually started thinking about that because I didn't think about that. I was just trying to do what I wanted to do and trying to figure out who I should be or wanted to be.
It doesn't seem like your dad encouraged you to take advantage of his notoriety.
Well, no.
No, some people would. But
not
other people wouldn't.
Not on purpose. I think if you really wanted to do something and you needed him to help get access, maybe I think he would. He's done that before, but doing it just to be doing it, no. But I don't think any of us ever did that. At least I never. I don't think I ever just did it just to be doing it. But my memory's shaky. He exposed us indirectly. So he would play Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, people like that all the time. Just play it. Now, whether or not, I can't say what was going on in his head, whether or not he was thinking, hey, this would be exposure. But to me, the way I view it, it was, I want to listen to this. This is what I like. It's good for you all to listen to it, but I'm not going to say, sit down, listen to it. And I don't think thinking about it, I don't think he ever just sat down and said, hey, boom, 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 boom. I think you just got it. You either got it or you didn't get it. But it was out there. Like the music, it was out there. And even with his work, I don't ever remember him saying this would be a great field for any of us to go into, meaning politics. And even if you look at his life, I don't think that was something he was looking to do either. I think he liked writing. I think he liked doing that newspaper thing. And it just kind of happened. The opportunity came up. I was very small. So I'm just pulling this off of memory and what people may have told me. And I may be totally wrong, but I'm thinking, when the seat came up, he decides to run. I don't know. I just don't know. He never actually said to me, this is what I wanted to do. But it seemed to me that sometimes we do things in life because the opportunity is there. And so you take the opportunity. So I guess the more I talk about it and listen to it out loud, I guess it would make sense for him to have done that, being an activist, to get inside and try to work it from the inside. But again, when you get down there, you're one voice. If it's 159 counties, and so if you're coming down there, you're just one. And even if you've got the inner city, all of those reps, you're still, so I don't know how effective politically you could be. It's going to take some maintenance. People have to ensure that it is maintained in that fashion, because if you don't, then people will just forget, and that's what will happen. And as far as remembering him, how should he be remembered? Well, as a father for sure, as a political figure, and what he liked to say, a race man, and that I think would define him. And as he got older, I think, again, just my impression, I think he zeroed in more on that as far as the legacy piece and the teaching piece. It's like that picture up there, which is not on camera's picture of my father and Michael walking with my grandfather through Atlanta University campus. And my grandfather, who I vaguely remember, he passed away when I was 6 or 7 years old. Mm-hmm. But he was obviously pro-education. He kept saying to him, you can do all these great things. You can speak at the Democratic National Convention. You can run for elected office. He said, but the best thing you could ever do is to get an education. And he really wanted him to do that. So it's ironic, you know, at the start of one career, you're being told to go that way. And then towards the end of that career that you were starting all those years ago, you end up going that way anyway. You know, so that's where he ended up. And I think for, you know, some of his students, it probably was helpful, obviously, to have someone who was in it to talk about what it is that he was teaching, you know, the things that he experienced during the civil rights movement. And some of that stuff, those students get that I don't even know, because at the time that it was happening, that's not something you'd come home and share with a 7 or 8 year old, you know, how your day went as it related to dealing with those kind of issues. So some of that I was insulated from, you know, as you would all your kids. You would not share the low points, and sometimes not even the high points, because we were kids. So we didn't get to go to a lot of the parties and this, you know, the things when things got passed and celebrated and stuff, because, you know, we were kids. So again, the education part is very important. It's even ironic that after all of the time that I spent at my job, I ended up going that way. And I had thought that during my retirement that I would be teaching, but as we discussed earlier, there are just not a lot of opportunities, you know, to do those types of things. And I don't have, even though I have a 30-year career in that field, in the graduate degree, master's degree, whatever, and all that stuff, you just can't find it. So for him, I think it was helpful. And then too, you know, the timing of it, you know, ultimately though, when you look at historical figures, because that's what we're talking about, we have to remember, obviously, all the things that they did that were positive, and also remember that they are indeed human, and they have human failings just like everybody. And everybody is not a saint. Everybody doesn't live like Mother Teresa. But the big picture of a person's life is, what did they do? Big picture. So big picture, what did he do? He fought for people of color. He fought for the right to vote, the right to eat wherever you want to eat, things of that nature, and continued to fight for human rights, changed it from civil rights to human rights. And really, we're still having this struggle. And I don't know if you want to keep this in here, but that's why I'm moving. And I'm tired of being in a place where you have to struggle. I'm tired of the struggle. I grew up in the struggle. I watched the people struggle. You know, I'm talking about my father. I'm talking about John Lewis. All these people do this. It still has to happen. I don't want to struggle anymore. I want to, quote unquote, live the American dream, where you don't have to do all of these types of things. But unfortunately, it's not like that. It has to change. And for me, living the way that I've lived, growing up the way that I've grown up, I could not have done what he did. And so I have a lot of admiration for that, because I just could not have done it. Historical figures that step up and do that have a desire to see humanity improve and the condition of all people be improved. And I just wish I was like that. I don't want to march. I don't want to do it anymore. I'm tired of it. At a certain point, how long do you have to do this? How long? How long are we going to have to fight for civil rights? How long are we going to have to fight for human rights? Forever? Until everybody in my entire, how long? And I don't mean that rhetorically. I'm serious. And I just, at a certain point, like, you know, hats off to my brother for doing the work that he does. I just can't. I can't. Mm-mm.